some characteristics of a once dominant power that has passed its time. It is complacent, it is highly bureaucratized and seeking short-term gains rather than long-term productive breakthroughs. It is socially and politically divided, aware of the need for reforms, yet unwilling or unable to make them, and suffering a loss of faith in the national project that once animated it. And today, China clearly benefits from a potent national will and ambition, and a unified national identity among much of the population. It is pouring resources into human capital, research and development, high technology, and infrastructure. But how effectively is the question? What factors may balance the scales or contribute to the competition? If necessity is the mother of invention, war is the midwife of innovation. And China is not innovative. China's espionage activities against America began more than a decade ago, and they stole what they needed. In its own industry, the Chinese do not encourage mistakes. No one will go out on a limb if he fears being shot down. However, this was not always true. They used to be incredibly creative. And for a couple of thousand years, between the 9th century BC, excuse me, to about 1500 AD, the Chinese invented an amazing variety of things, including cast iron, chess, the compass, the crossbow, crop rotation, decimal places, gunpowder, porcelain, paper, paper money, wallpaper, toilet paper, the stirrup, silk, the toothbrush, and wood block printing 200 years before Gutenberg's movable type. So why did the inventiveness stop about the year 1500? 700 years ago. It seems they basically just stopped trying, possibly because there was no mercantile class, or because a student's ambition was to join the imperial bureaucracy rather than the world of competition. Complacency ruled. Lack of incentives became the norm, as did mediocrity. Sinologists will be debating this until the Great Wall crumbles into sand. We just don't know why. And yet, 2 years after Mao Zedong's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping led China away from a planned economy and Maoist ideology toward elements of capitalism. They opened up to foreign investments in technology, introduced its vast labor force to the global market, and turned China into one of the world's fastest growing economies. It was an amazing transformation. Over the decade, a bit late in the game, China's leadership identified innovation as the way forward for development. The promise of innovation has been epitomized by China's tech entrepreneurs, including billionaire founders like Jack Ma of Alibaba. But the dream of innovation has collided with the harsh reality of overwork in a technology sector that seems sapped of opportunities for breakthrough. Jack Ma and others have advocated a severe culture of overtime that has become known as 996, working from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. 6 days a week. This extreme work environment has been dubbed wolf culture, a climate of fierce. Ian Harris, I have to say, he heard this lecture about 4 days ago. I'm amazed that you're back for a second time. There you go, terrific. Well, welcome. This extreme work environment, dubbed wolf culture, is a climate of fierce workplace competition, and observers have drawn a straight line from the 996 culture to the lying flat movement. One of the dominant slogans of the lying flat movement has been, don't buy property, don't buy a car, don't get married, don't have children, and don't consume. For this reason, calls to lie flat have doubly concerned China's leadership, as it threatens to sap the country of the ambition to innovate and to knock down the second leg of the country's long-term development strategy, the drive to consume. China's focus now is outward-looking power projection. This is to be expected for a nation intent on dominating global markets and leveraging the political influence that it believes should come with its outsized economic status and its billion-person market. It has invested in a military commensurate with such ambition. It is tripling its inventory of long-range nuclear missiles, fielding fifth generation of fighter aircraft, and it's expanded its navy to 360 ships. Though China has the largest navy in the world, and the US Navy is the second, the Chinese have smaller coastal ships, whereas the American Navy, even with fewer ships, has more power. China hasn't fought a war since a brief contest with Vietnam 44 years ago. And unlike American forces who have fought for most of the past 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, China's service members have virtually no combat experience and are untested, which some Chinese leaders have referred to as a peace disease. In the meantime, China confronts a growing array of other challenges, including sluggish consumption, rising unemployment, a dramatic downturn in the housing market, lack of business confidence, local government's debt distress, increasing tension with the United States over technology sanctions, and an aging population. In the long term, China will have severe demographic problems. The 35-year-long one-child policy created huge imbalances, including because of the preference for sons, not enough women for the men to marry. In urban areas, people are putting off marriage, and when they do marry, couples often only want one child or none, as they are seen as being very expensive. What do we know about expensive children? Current projections paint a devastating picture with official birth rate in China of 1.3 children per woman, which is far below replacement rate, which is 2.1 children per woman. There are projections that births will continue to decline and deaths will continue to rise and surpass births by 6 million people in only 2 years. That's an incredible number. There will not be enough earners to support the huge number of retirees. An approaching problem that has flown under Beijing's radar is the crisis of the Chinese family, the foundation of Chinese society, where kinship is a pillar of the society. The family is the most important institution helping people in times of adversity or helping them seize opportunities in good times. The focus of the family will turn from rearing the young to taking care of the old. In the future, growing numbers of men will enter old age without spouses or children to care for them. And China will have to build a huge welfare state and will have fewer resources with which to influence events abroad. The pool of military age manpower will be made up of the single child in families, and any death in combat will mean lineage extinction, not only for those 2 parents, but for the grandparents and the larger. So that will extinguish those lineages. What will be the political and the social impact of that? And there's another important point. Home to 20% of the global population, but only 7 to 9% of the world's arable land, China has an extreme food shortage. And to help combat the crisis, the Chinese Communist Party has over time purchased about 400,000 acres of US farmland, in addition to livestock, seed, and food supply lines. It does not take a top secret security clearance to imagine the dangerous implications of China maintaining undue leverage over the US food supply. Although food security is not always at the top of the national security conversations, it should be. Or, one might say, food security should be higher on the food chain. On the other hand, and here's a shocker, the Israeli government has drafted a plan to lease most of the Negev Desert, which comprises about 60% of the state. And under the plan, China would take over 250,000 of unirrigated land for 21 years in order to plant new crops. And they would build the desalination plant that would be necessary to water those plants. So how's the US doing? The relative decline of American manufacturing is the backstory of a major breakdown in defense procurement. Our defense industrial base is not equipped to support a conventional war. And the situation is even worse for our European allies. The big five US defense contractors say they cannot be expected to maintain arms manufacturing capacity when the government's needs are so unpredictable. The procurement problem goes deeper than just the supply of munitions. New submarines will not be available for deployment until 2031. The Government Accounting Office recently identified delays in 17 major programs, including destroyers, drones, and helicopters. And the GAO says the figures do not show the full extent causes or risks of deferred maintenance. In 2021, the naval fleet lost 1,500 days waiting for repair. And that's the equivalent of having 4 fewer submarines. And there are other problems. One example of which is that the 35 critical minerals that the US needs, there are 31 minerals which we need. And of those, it is reliant on imports for 31 of them. And then there is the nuclear conundrum. China's expansion of its nuclear arsenal raises questions over how best to proceed. And the buildup is changing geopolitics. China's decision to superpower size its nuclear arsenal suggests that Beijing seeks nuclear parity with America and Russia. Now, parity can be enjoyed by rivals in a bipolar system, but it cannot be achieved in a tripolar system. 3 countries are not the same as 2 countries. It is just not possible for each member of the 3 to match the combined arsenals of its 2 rivals. A hunger for quick success pervades China's industry, and innovations that can make money immediately are rewarded, but long-term research that might lead to world-changing innovation is not being done. The Chinese Communist Party's goal is to achieve the greatest benefit at the least cost. China's test-oriented education system discourages independent thinking, and the Communist Party uses propaganda to instill a sense of loyalty and gratitude in the people. It is interesting but not surprising that in a recent item about a laboratory seeking to hire 2 mid-level officials, the first requirement was that the candidates possess high ideological and political qualities and adhere to the guidance of Xi Jinping's new era of socialism. Each year, China graduates 7 times as many engineers and scientists as we do, and China recruits its best graduates into its military industry. US graduates work for big tech companies that don't or won't work for the Pentagon. How do we counter that? The West imagines and invents the future, and innovation is our greatest advantage over China. China doesn't tolerate mistakes. In the West, if an idea goes wrong, too bad. But you know, if at first you don't succeed, try again. As I mentioned earlier, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is the Pentagon's brain. It was founded in 1958 by President Eisenhower to prevent another Sputnik. It doesn't do research itself, but funds ideas that it thinks it will work. And over the years, it has changed the course of society and war. My favorite example is that in 1968, Robert Taylor, an experimental psychologist, was working with 4 universities who were hundreds of miles apart and was frustrated that it took so long for them to share their research. He went to the head of DARPA to request money to try to figure out how to link them. The director thought it was a good idea, but was concerned about reliability. If one university had a problem, he didn't want the others contaminated by it. And Taylor agreed to try to put redundancy into the program. The director asked Taylor how much money he wanted, and Taylor, off the top of his head, said $1 million. Taylor got the grant and headed back to his office. He later recalled the astonishment he felt when he looked at his watch and realized that that meeting had taken only 20 minutes. A 20-minute meeting was the beginning of the internet. And the beat goes on. Satellites are crucial for spying and communications. They are also vulnerable to attack and disruption. And the US is worried that its satellite network is not up to snuff, but it has a plan and it has DARPA. SBACN, the Space-Based Adaptive Communications Node, or to its friends, Space Bacon, will, if successful, create a laser-enabled military internet in orbit around the Earth by piggybacking on new satellites that are to be launched anyway. These satellites will have laser transceivers, which can both receive and transmit communications, and will be able to communicate with counterparts as far away as 3,000 miles. Lasers are hard to intercept and almost impossible to jam. And equipment that can condense many gigabytes of material into a single beam will greatly simplify and protect information. And if all goes well, a prototype will be tested before 2025. In computing power, the US still has a substantial lead. China is staggeringly dependent on foreign semiconductor technology to undertake complex computation, even while it is pouring billions of dollars into its chip industry. And here I'm going to give you another footnote. If you haven't already, you really must take a look at a book by Chris Miller called Chip War. He is a fellow at Philadelphia's Foreign Policy Research Institute, and this book on chips and what these chips do and can do and why they're so expensive and why they've gotten tinier and tinier is extraordinary. It's written in readable English. And one of the things I loved about it was that the chapters were 4 and 5 pages long, which means like it was a bunch of short stories. So it explains to us, I mean, there are some here who are young, but for those of the rest of us, it's really helpful to know why chips are so important, and they are the basis of so many things that are in a lady's pocketbook or in your homes. Even under the most optimistic projections, it will be half a decade before China can design competitive chips and the needed software around them, and far longer before it can manufacture its chips domestically. It didn't manufacture the ones it's using now. In the past, the military simply bought cutting-edge US chips off the shelf and plugged them into their military systems. In the past, that is what was done. The question for us is, how do we get on top of this competition? We need to fund federal R&D at roughly $2 trillion over 10 years. We need a radical revision of tax policy to favor capital-intensive manufacturing. We need subsidies for mission-critical industries, and we certainly need to shift defense priorities from the old legacy systems toward innovation, including space-based missile defense, cyber warfare, and drones. And we need Congress to provide military services with the support they need to think about strategy. Those who participate in strategic thought should be linked to think tanks and academia far more effectively than they are today. And we need to shift educational priorities toward engineering and hard science and encourage graduates to consider military service. Certainly, larger salaries and better benefits would surely help. It should be noted that we are not just sitting idly by. Congress took a major step last year that had semiconductor executives around the globe in a panic. Companies using American code, equipment, or people to make advanced computer chips bound for China had to stop on pain of breaking the law. It was a salvo from America's new economic weapon, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which attempts to weaponize the ubiquity of American technology. It lets the US claim jurisdiction over almost every chip factory in the world because almost every one contains hard-to-replace American parts. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, often referred to by its initials TSMC, is the global leader in advanced semiconductors. It has almost 80% of the advanced semiconductor market. It stopped selling advanced chips to Chinese customers immediately. Another example, big chip companies around the world stopped shipping to Huawei. The firm's revenues dropped by 30%, and its popular smartphones disappeared from the market altogether. This export compliance law is a new way to crimp adversaries the US perceives as a national security threat. Japan and the Netherlands, home to two of the most important chip-making equipment manufacturers, reached a deal with America in January. If both create strong controls of their own, China will be firmly barred from advanced semiconductors. A superpower's heft is underwritten by its wealth and military power. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and the stunning victory in Desert Storm that set the stage for domestic and strategic complacency in military affairs. And you will have to forgive me this footnote. Desert Storm was sort of amazing. If you remember, Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait because he wanted their oil. The US got together a coalition of about 34 countries to go after him. You remember General Schwarzkopf was in charge. And that campaign lasted a total of 100 hours. When Middle East expert Bernard Lewis heard 100 hours, he said, it shouldn't have been called Desert Storm. It should have been called Coitus Interruptus. I just can't resist that every time I hear Desert Storm. But to get back to where we were, by the numbers, the current picture is not encouraging. We have reduced the numbers of most of the military's components, men, planes, and ships. And the military is now much older across its combat platforms. Air Force fighters are 32 years old. More than half of the Navy ships are more than 20 years old. And the Abrams tank averages 30 years. The intercontinental ballistic missile, the Minuteman III, was introduced in 1970 and was meant to serve 10 years. Those missiles remain in their silos and are not scheduled to be retired until 2029, a half a century longer than planned. And the US has not conducted a test of its nuclear weapons for over 30 years, but we assure ourselves that everything will work as intended. A military that generates no orders for major equipment or munitions means a commensurate reduction and stagnation of the industrial base that provides the materials needed for war. And resurrecting the needed capacity takes years. And not just the manufacturing capabilities, but perhaps more critically in the training of the highly skilled workers needed to make the advanced equipment. How others see us is dependent on our support for our own national defense. The US depends on volunteer forces to defend strategic interests, and our military is only as good as its people. More than 3/4 of America's 17 to 24-year-olds who normally constitute the pool of potential recruits are ineligible because of health problems, obesity, substance abuse, or criminal records. Only 9% of American youths express interest in serving. And the overlap between the 9% who are interested and the percentage who are eligible is tiny, and unfortunately shows that few Americans have both the interest and the ability to serve. In this administration, we've seen the worst drop in recruitment in 50 years. We are down more than 15,000 Army recruits, not including the 8,000 service members who were dismissed because of the vaccine mandate. With operations shifting to the realms of cyber, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic weapons, the lack of qualified recruits could become a national security handicap. In sum, the US military is too small, too old, and lacks necessary levels of readiness. America's defense industrial base is constrained and in many places moribund. And speaking broadly, the public appears to lack the interest to ensure that defense investments are commensurate with the nation's best interests. We have work to do, and we must make our defenses ready to defend us. Our long-term force structure must be funded appropriately. This year's budget has only a 3.2 increase over last year, and with inflation, give or take around 6%, it means a decline in actual purchasing power. A hefty portion of any Army increase will be absorbed by a 5.2 pay increase. Choosing massive government expansion, increasing social programs, giveaways, and entitlements over the government's duty to protect Americans is not a gamble we should take. And the US is not procuring sufficient quantities of its best precision weapons to last at best more than a few weeks. It is difficult to stop a hypersonic missile with student loan forgiveness. US political and business leaders are beginning to grasp what is at stake. The passage of the $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act last year shows that for the first time in decades, Washington is willing to spend substantial sums of money to support chip makers. It offers $39 billion in subsidies, a 25% tax credit to promote manufacturing at home, as well as $13 billion of investment in chip research. But it's too bad that the handout comes with handcuffs. After its passage, the administration added conditions to the bill saying that companies receiving grants will be required to use union workers, use US-made iron and steel for construction of facilities, share their profits with the government, and provide affordable childcare for workers. These additions will raise costs for participants, and just the paperwork will slow down the projects. The question is whether companies will be willing to accept the attached strings. And however, there are some changes afoot. There are Silicon Valley renegades who highlight how sclerotic the traditional defense contracting system has become. One such company helps organizations use AI, and another helps monitor risks and enhance surveillance. These tech Davids are taking on America's distended military-industrial Goliath in order to make things quickly and relatively cheaply, a most positive development. There is another positive development. In February, the new House of Representatives Committee on the Strategic Competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party had impressive hearings. Did anybody see those when it was on TV? It was, I thought, very impressive. And the key word is competition. The US can't know how to beat China without understanding our own assets and liabilities. The committee leadership had worked hard to present a unified front, so when a Democratic representative would ask a question, it could be followed by a Republican and vice versa. And it was obvious that they were on the same memo. And they had fantastic testifiers. But the committee leadership that worked so hard to present a united front already can see the fault lines that will turn partisan. Republicans frame the Communist Party's hegemonic ambitions as a national security problem, while the Democrats concentrate on the economic costs of China's industrial dominance. Disputes will rise to the surface when Congress must decide whether to increase defense spending or subsidize clean energy. A bipartisan Congress is resolved to confront China for now. Enjoy the unity while it lasts. The real challenge to this committee is to broaden its scope to include crucial aspects of domestic policy. It should first examine the domestic regulation of crucial supply chains, especially for semiconductors. The maze of these regulations is a very major negative. And second, ascertain if financial regulators such as the Treasury Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission should identify and even regulate American companies' financial relationships with China. And third, look at education. Should there be regulations to make relationships between US universities and Chinese universities more transparent? I'm a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and I wanted to find out how much money China had given toward the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. The amount is somewhere between $72 and $93 million. President Biden's pleasure was obvious when he appointed the president of Penn ambassador to Germany and the president of Penn's Board of Trustees ambassador to Canada. What nobody has mentioned in any of the articles I looked at was what exactly did China get in return? There is a growing conviction amongst the elite in Beijing and Moscow that they are at a disadvantage relative to the United States, and that this will worsen unless they move sooner rather than later. There are three potential principal reasons why China and Russia may want to confront the US sooner. First, the US military will require time to restructure and refit away from the Middle Eastern counterterrorism on which we have focused for the last 30 years toward high-intensity state-on-state conflict. And second are the domestic conditions in the US and Europe. Adversaries are keenly aware that America's research and development base can be mobilized to improve US capabilities. Time is on America's side when it comes to the quantity and sophistication of its weapon systems. And the third is the population pressure building within China. Whether war breaks out will depend on how badly China fears the global power shift in the next decade and how eager it will be to exploit its perceived current relative advantage. The US must have the credible capability to win the first battle. Winning the first battle deters aggression, but only up to a point. The US is in danger of winning the first battle over Taiwan, only to lose the war because it doesn't have the weapons to continue. By preparing ourselves militarily and economically, we can drive home a central point that any conflict, particularly over Taiwan or Korea, would be far messier and more violent than optimistic war planners envisage. Unfortunately, history teaches us that ambitious leaders tend to forget such simple truths. Thank you.
We've got about 15 minutes for audience Q&A. If you'd like to join me here at the podium.
Yeah, anybody have any questions or comments, please?
Raise your hand.
Do you think China has a red line?
Let's wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you. Thanks, Art.
Hi, Bunty. Does China have a red line for action in Taiwan, given the relative balance that between the two countries?
I'm afraid you'd have to ask them.
Okay.
So what do you see China gets out of its relationship with Russia?
Perceived power. It wants to be what's basically to replace the US in the global scene. And functioning with Russia, which was one of the two great superpowers, it is seen to be, and it seems to be in the catbird seat. It's telling Russia what to do. Russia has not done very well in the Ukraine. And it's impressive. I've been listening to a couple of podcasts on what China has done in Latin America and in Africa. They're being really incredibly smart. And in Africa, of course. Mm-hmm. Though with their Belt and Road Initiative, I have to tell you, I was struck by the comment that they built a water purification plant in Ecuador about 5 years ago near a functioning volcano. And it's amazing that the water purification plant has hundreds of cracks in it. Oops, I wouldn't want to live downstream from that. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
And Bunsey, what do you think of the latest Chinese arrangement with Saudi Arabia and Iran, bringing those two together and using the Chinese currency instead of the American dollar as for oil purchases?
I'm not crazy about it. And it was amazing, for those of you who read the Wall Street Journal, on Thursday of that week, the journal discussed the arrangement between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Iran that the US was trying to moderate, whatever. And it was 24 hours later that they reported on the Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China something. Their desire to, okay, how do you pronounce yuan? How do you pronounce yuan? Is it yuan? Yuan. Okay. A friend of mine told me I was wrong, but I was right. It was impressive. It was very impressive. And they're doing more of these arrangements with the Belt and Road Initiative that they will be repaid in yuan. And I'm not a good enough economist, not an economist at all, to know what the impact of that will be on the dollar's strength in the world.
My question was a follow-up to that, just with the currency in the United States. Do you foresee the US government being legitimately concerned that the US dollar will drop based off of Russia and China's entanglements around that?
I'm afraid I'm going to show you my political bias when I said I have no idea. I think our government is wearing a blindfold. And there also is a problem in the United States that, the agricultural guys talk to each other and the military guys talk to each other over here. And there doesn't seem to me be much interaction when they're dealing with basically a couple of really important global challenges. And I wish I felt more secure about what our government was doing. So I don't know.
A separate unrelated question. With the US military, do you still feel that, for example, rules of engagement apply to the current political scene? For example, when you mentioned drones, so China is used to a type of engagement called drone swarming, where the US isn't as commonly practicing it due to red tape. Do you still feel rules of engagement apply?
They have to take a look at this. This is different from their last 30-year ago engagement. They're also, I don't know what they're called, but I saw that the Ukraine had small, narrow, sort of cigar-looking boats, and they were able to swarm those in a port, stopping the activity. I thought that was pretty impressive because they must be incredibly inexpensive. People were not involved, and that was a good thing. So it's part of what I said in terms of the military people who are dealing with strategy really have to engage with academia and with the think tanks, because there, I think now some of our best minds are there. And I happen to enjoy listening to the podcasts from a number of those think tanks. Some are better than others. Please. Oh, I'm sorry, Ian first.
Yeah, today Warren Buffett announced that he's setting a significant position in TSMC.
Is he?
And I wonder why. Well, the official explanation was that the money can be deployed in other better investments than TSMC. So he's
Say that again.
Today
Okay, Warren Buffett.
disinvested a significant amount of his
I
position in
disinvested. Okay, I
Correct.
missed that word.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wonder what that portends. And the official
That's-
commentary was, there are other places that will exhibit better returns and continue to stay invested in TSMC.
It's possible. TSMC is also building plants elsewhere, like in Arizona. So there will be changes afoot. Some people seem to be more awake than some of our government officials. But that I did not see that about Warren Buffett. Thanks.
I was privileged to be here when you invited some notable world leaders. And so I was wondering if you were thinking about inviting Vladimir Zelensky.
I'd love to, but I'm not even on the board of the World Affairs Council.
I'll
You have
put
to
you-
address that to Lauren. Yeah, the big thing in my career was having Gorbachev and
Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher in
Yeah.
the same month.
Uh,
And I got a thank you letter from Margaret Thatcher, which,
uh,
as you can imagine, is framed in 3 places in my home. And it was addressed to the other Iron Lady. That was absolutely, she was, can I digress? She
Yes.
was phenomenal. She had just retired from being prime minister and she stood at the podium here. And somebody asked her a question about what was happening elsewhere in the world. She said, well, I will give you a tour d'horizon. And I saw her just move her finger across the top of the thing. And she started in Japan, went to China, to Russia, and so forth. And she gave her assessment of what was happening around the world. It was so impressive. I cannot tell you. I wish we had a tape of that. Lauren tells me that they're going to be doing a 75th anniversary. So they're looking through old stuff. And if you have part of that Margaret Thatcher experience, that was amazing.
You know,
Presentations besides that one, and I'd like to see you involved in bringing in those kinds of speakers.
I do if any of you belong to a church or a synagogue that want a story, a talk on the funny things that happened at the World Affairs Council, I can do that because there are many, including, for example, who was the worst speaker we ever had. It was an ambassador, and I swear to you, it was a French ambassador, and I think he fell asleep on the podium when he was speaking. Honest to goodness, he started to get sort of not, it was amazing. But we had, and we'll continue to have, this extraordinary list of journalists, heads of state. I was not at the event, but there's Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951 speaking to the World Affairs Council. It was only 2 years after we were founded. And that was before he was ousted by the CIA in 1953, and the Shah came into Iran. That having Mossadegh, that impressed the hell out of me. But we had some really extraordinary people and business leaders. It was really fun.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Being the richest of all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, please.
I have a question, and this was great, by the way. I know you mentioned how like agricultural people don't talk to military people and these people don't talk whatever. What do you think can be done about that? As an example, can there be some sort of bipartisan, multi-partisan group of business leaders with government leaders, agricultural, military leaders sitting down over like a 3-month period and trying to come up with ideas, you know, and strategies to
Of
get
course.
that to happen?
It makes sense. I think some of this is being done in the think tanks in Washington. I know there's an organization that brings military, even mid-level military people to Israel for X number of days to talk with their counterparts in the Israeli Defense Forces. And Israel is now part of CENTCOM, so there's more conversation going on. Yeah, of course it can be done, but we don't seem to be doing it. And the think tanks, in some instances, are really picking up the pieces where they have the consul generals who are in Washington get together. And you need more of that cross communication. Watch out, we'll appoint you.
We can talk about that later. Okay, thank you very much.
time for one more question. I think Gina's heading straight to the back, right under our picture of Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, I see. And there's me with Giscard d'Estaing wearing a fake chinchilla hat. I wouldn't say that to everybody. But do you see it?
We wanted to make sure the picture of the chinchilla hat had
Yeah,
a place
right,
of honor
right.
here.
Right. I learned very quickly that if I wore hats and if I wore big necklaces, you wouldn't see my belly. And so it just means get your eyes up. Yes, sir.
So as a young person with the recent debates in the US around TikTok, I was wondering if you see the internet and kind of social media starting to become a crucial factor around the US and China relations.
Absolutely. I am of my generation, so I really don't know all that much about how social media functions. But it seems like an incredible vehicle for getting out what you want to get out. It's interesting, you know, that TikTok in China is different from TikTok outside of China. And so they can control that. I don't know enough about it, but it's very impressive.
Please join me with a round of applause, thanking Bunty Alice Churchill. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Feel free to take a look at the photos in the back wall, Chinchilla Hat and Margaret Thatcher. We look forward to seeing you all again at a program soon. Thank you.